morning, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Good evening and good night. We have a worldwide session for you this morning, which is all fitting for the discussion we're having about the rights of nature. I hope you've been enjoying the RISE Summit so far. My name is Shannon Olson. I'm Global Director of the ECHO Network, and this is a topic that's very near and dear to our hearts. Just a quick word about the ECHO Network. We are a social innovation partnership with the specific focus of increasing trust between sectors, increasing the value of science for society, and instilling a sense of responsibility for everyone, for India's human and environmental ecosystems. We actually have built almost a 2,000 member international community now that spans 40 countries and enables organizations and individuals to interact and generate shared purpose through collaborative science-based research. So we're a science network. And the topic that we're discussing today has really been spearheaded by our own head of engagement, Tina Petrau, and she's assembled this wonderful group of people together for you. And we're very excited to engage in this discussion. Just to give you a little bit of background of what we're talking about today, the rights of nature and people is really one of the core subjects that we have to start thinking about as we go forward in this century, because we are really at the intersection of this issue every single day. Earlier this week, a friend on Twitter sent me a link of a highway in India where 13 black buck had leaped to their death because they had no other way to cross the road. And it was incredibly painful to see, not only because black buck are an Indian antelope, an endemic species, but also because I studied them from my own research as an ecologist at NCDS in Bangalore. And it was incredibly painful to see, but this image really brings to the forefront the issue we're discussing to me. What should be the rights of nature? Our animals, our plants, our water bodies, our environment. What are their rights and what are our rights as human beings? Because we do need to get from point A to point B. We do need to grow and develop. We have increasing demands over the next 50 years. How are we going to meet those demands while also respecting the nature around us? So that is the purpose of the discussion here. We have a fantastic group of individuals to speak with you here today, but I'd like to start by having Kamal Bawa give a nice overview of the topic to you for about the next 10 minutes. Kamal's a really good friend of mine. He's been a mentor of mine for many years. He is the founder, president, and chair of the Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and Environment. He's also a distinguished professor of biology at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. And I will not speak anymore, and I will let the experts speak themselves. So Kamal, thank you for being with us, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Shannon, and good morning as well as good evening, wherever you might be. And I'm just delighted to participate in this forum and really want to thank, first of all, ECHONET for giving me the opportunity to share my thoughts. I have worked in India for almost 60 years in the field, starting as a graduate student in early 60s. And I've seen a continuous decline in biodiversity over these last 60 years. So when we talk about the loss of biodiversity, I think there are many people now in my age group that can relate personally to the crisis we are facing. And so the overall question before us is how we can enrich our approaches to strengthen conservation of biodiversity and its sustainable use while keeping in mind all sorts of rights of nature, rights of people, and so on and so forth. The organizers gave me a list of questions from which I can choose to address a few, and I've chosen to address 5 questions, and I'll go over those very, very quickly. I think first question I want to consider is, what is the potential of rights? Potential of right-based approaches, especially in India. But first of all, what are the rights-based approaches? I think we are basically talking about 3 types of rights. There is a human rights concept which has a very deep history in philosophy and law, and it is guaranteed in many political systems. Then there is a nature's rights concept, which again has a long history in philosophy, but it has a short history in law. And it is guaranteed in very few political systems. And then there's the concept of indigenous rights, which incorporates both the rights, both human rights as well as nature rights. And it again has been discussed in some countries. I think prominent examples are Ecuador, Brazil, and of course India, as Shannon mentioned. And coming to now the question of what is the potential, especially in Indian context, which I know very well, or better than at other places. And it is deeply enshrined. I think the rights of nature concept is very, very deeply enshrined in our history, in our culture, in our traditions. And the concept of Dharti Mata, Mother Earth, which again is the concept is very, very common in many countries all over the world. I think implicitly recognizes the rights of the earth, the rights of the planet, rights of living beings on the earth. But there has been recent legislation, and I think Shannon has already referred to the outcome of that legislation granting rights to rivers is somewhat uncertain at this time. But there has been also a major development in terms of the human rights. Human rights as symbolized by the enactment of the Forest Rights Act, which guarantees certain rights to indigenous people in India, the tribal communities, the local marginalized communities. So I think India is a good example to keep in mind in our larger debate and our larger discussions today. The next question I think I want to deal with is, what is the progress? What is the sort of progress we have made in recent years in terms of conservation of biodiversity, keeping in mind the rights of the local communities, and keeping in mind the rights of nature. Both Shannon and I had a very good fortune of participating in a biodiversity collaborative, which is a coalition of many organizations in India. And the biodiversity collaborative in recent years have championed the cause of a national mission on biodiversity and human well-being. The National Mission on Biodiversity and Human Well-being has been sponsored by the Prime Minister's Science, Technology, Innovation Council. Working together over the last 3 or 4 years, we have developed a roadmap for the mission. I think the main elements of the mission are linkage between conservation and restoration of biodiversity with human rights and human well-being. The mission has 7 components: agriculture, climate change, mapping life of India, and one can go on and on. And so the mission seeks to deal with the issue of decline in biodiversity in a very comprehensive way, in a very collaborative way. And by collaborative, I mean working together among various stakeholders, and the principal stakeholders being local communities. So once the mission gets going, we hope soon, there would be work underway at several sites in the country. As a matter of fact, pilots are already underway in many of these places. And I think there the approach is, while we keep in mind the need to conserve nature, we are conscious and aware of rights of the local communities in terms of using those resources, and we recognize our approaches must link preservation of nature with human well-being. And each component of the mission is linked with specific goals, specific sustainable development goals. And the next question I want to consider, and I'll be done in a couple of minutes, nature's right, have they made a difference? There has been discussion now going on for a number of years. And concept of nature's right, a formal concept of nature rights is more than 50 years old, starting with Christopher Stone's work. Now there's a larger concept, the concept of Earth system law, which makes us move forward. And there has been, again, a number of efforts in terms of empowerment of local communities and indigenous groups. And the law has been applied to various environmental issues, biodiversity, rivers, ecosystems, and so on and so forth. So we are making progress. And I also want us to keep in perspective the difference between North and South perspectives. This is one of the issues I was asked to comment on. I think in the North, we have well-developed legal systems. I'm talking about global North. And there is protection for some non-human entities, or it has been discussed, corporations, unions, partnerships. I would say fairly long history. And current systems are too rigid in dealing with biodiversity and climate crisis. In contrast, in South, there is strong tradition and culture, and perhaps not so strong legal systems. And current systems are too weak in dealing with capitalism, markets, and climate crisis. So we have to keep these differences in mind. And what we need is a system that combines virtues of each. Indigenous communities' rights to use resources, and these rights are protected, and ecosystems' rights to exist and to be protected. And the last few words are, where do we go from here? And I'm reminded of Thomas Berry's quote, rivers have river rights, birds have bird rights, and humans have human rights. The whole rights-based approach is becoming a significant tool in our discourses, and it is bound to gain strength. But we should keep in mind, it is not a panacea. And thank you for this opportunity. I may have exceeded my 10 minutes, for which I seek forgiveness. Thank you.
There is no forgiveness needed, Kamal. It's always a joy and a privilege to listen to you. And you've been so inspirational to me, and I'm so grateful to hear your thoughts. And what a wonderful introduction to the topic. And I deeply appreciative of you being here with us today. So now we're going to start the discussion. I see that we already have some questions in the chat. I think I actually will pose the one question to Kamal right now because it just came up. Kamal, one of Deepali has asked what strategies that we could use to mitigate anthropogenic activities on our ecosystems. I think this is a good question for you, and you mentioned it a bit with the national mission, some of the activities, but maybe you can give a couple examples. You should unmute yourself, Kamal. Sorry, you're muted.
Sorry. I thought since I exceeded my 10 minutes, I will not be allowed to speak anything at all. But in any case, yeah, as I mentioned, I think our approaches have to be very comprehensive. I think we have we have a wide variety of tools now at our disposal, and any conservation efforts have to be linked with the rights of local communities and participation of local communities, and the linkage of not only linkage of biodiversity, health, one might say, and human well-being.
Yeah, I completely agree. There's a lot of strategies out there right now, and I appreciate that you mentioned that the rights of nature is one of those types of thinking and types of strategies, but there's many tools out there, and we need many tools. We need many practices, I think, because this is a very a large poly crisis that we're facing with our biodiversity and our ecosystems. So I thank you so much for outlining this. I think at this point, I will introduce the speakers for the next panel session. And Kamal, please stay online as long as you can so you can also answer. And I see Maureen is here, so I'm super happy. We, at the Echo Network, we believe in cross-sector viewpoints. So this is actually a very much a worldwide and a very cross-sector panel. And I encourage all of you in the audience to please ask your questions. We're going to try to answer as many of those as possible in the chat at the end of the session, and as many in between as we have time. So I will just start by introducing this wonderful panel. I have to really thank Tina Petrau, who is our head of engagement, who has done so much research on this subject. She's gotten a lot of help from Adaraj, who's here as one of our panel members, and she has really connected with all of these wonderful individuals who are going to talk to us about this topic today. So, and they represent all different aspects. They represent the law, they represent political science, academics, ecology with Kamal, and also the industrial perspective. All of these perspectives are needed. We need to hear from each of these voices. We need to have conversations like this. So I hope we will start this process today. I would like to introduce Adaraj Naik. He is the co-founder for the Initiative Climate Action, and he's also a faculty at Azim Premji University here in India and a member of the Rights of Rivers South Asia Alliance. We have Costanza Prieto Figueres. She is the Latin American Legal Director for the Earth Law Center in New York. We have Craig Kaufman. He is the Associate Professor and Director of Graduate Studies at the University of Oregon, and also a member of the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature. Maureen Panjuli is also here, and she's coming to us from Fiji, and she's part of the Pacific Network on Globalization. And last but certainly not least, also another very close friend to the network, we have Sivakumar Anantha Subramanian. He is the head of regulatory affairs of South Asia and global home care at Unilever. So this is our panel, and I'm going to start by asking each of you some questions, and if some of the others in the panel would like to also respond, you can just send me a chat or unmute yourself. But I think I'll start with you, Adaraj, because you really helped us to come up with this topic, and I think you're one of the first that really brought this to the forefront of our network. So, Kamal touched on this very beautifully a bit in his conversation before, but I'd like to also ask you, what do you think is the potential for this rights of nature movement as a movement across the world? How do you see this playing out, not only in South Asia, but maybe in other parts of the world as well?
Thank you very much, Shannon, for that question. And also thank you to Dr. Kamal Bau for those lovely framing words. So in a nutshell, if I may respond to that question, I think the potential for the rights of nature movement, as I see it, is absolutely tremendous and transformative in a global systemic scale. And therefore, there's so much excitement around what this movement signifies, not just on one or two continents, but on all continents, in legal systems that are based on common law traditions or continental traditions, and amongst both adherents of modern approaches, quote unquote, modern approaches to conservation and nature preservation, as well as indigenous knowledge systems. So I think for me, in some sense, following from what Dr. Bauer mentioned, once there is a acknowledgement and recognition of an entity or an object or a landscape as a holder of rights, it really opens up the pathway to many, many different conceptions of dignity or well-being or autonomy or freedom or respect in a equal sense, right? And if one just looks at the history of the human rights movement, right? Even if one goes back all the way to the Magna Carta or the French Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, or even modern day constitutions, including the Indian Constitution, it starts off from an acknowledgement of rights, and then there is a cultural and a social and a psychological change. So I'm really seeing this as the start of an acknowledgement that business as usual cannot continue, right? An acknowledgement that in some sense our extractive treatment of nature almost as something that is made for our use and does not have any interest of its own cannot continue, right? And across the world, either through constitutions, right? For example, with Ecuador, or more recently in Panama, or even with the effort in Chile, you're seeing an introduction into the constitution, or in some cases, you're seeing a legislation, for example, in New Zealand. And in other cases, you're seeing a court acknowledging that nature has rights. My final word on the question is that this movement's extraordinary potential also draws from its ability to really integrate different kinds of supporters and defenders of nature, right? And if I may speak very, very bluntly, so far the fight to protect nature is being lost by the defenders, right? But when one has a legal acknowledgement of the rights and interests of nature, I think the paradigm and the dynamics change in a very, very significant way. So I'll stop with that. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Abhay. That was really beautifully stated. What a nice way to start the panel session. And you really mentioned this extractive nature that we have, and for sure, I think everyone, certainly everyone on this panel, but I think everyone in the audience is very familiar with this issue that we are, as a globe, over-consuming. Yet, at the same time, our demands are going to increase as our population grows, especially in the global south, where in most countries the population continues to increase, which means we have to find some balance between the two, because we do rely on these natural resources for our own survival. So that said, I would really like to turn the question over to Sivakumar and ask, from an industry perspective, I mean, what do you think about the rights of nature? Because oftentimes these are thought of in completely different terms: growth and development on one side, rights and protection of nature on the other. But really, the conversation has to always bring both together if we're really going to be able to address these issues. So I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Thanks, Shannon. No, so I'm probably the odd one out here coming from the industry, but look, there's no doubt that nature's rights have to be protected. Yes. Having said that, because there are a lot of benefits to it, and it, as Professor Abai said, and before Dr. Baba, it's depleting. So there's clearly a concern. There is clearly a need to conserve that. Having said that, it should be balanced, right? I'm coming from the industry where we believe that the conservation the conservation is important, but it should be more about sustainable sourcing and sustainable use of nature, and that's how it should go, because as we have been talking about human development, human rights, etc., the focus seems to be on the indigenous communities who are in and around these nature areas. But the fact of the matter is nature offers a lot of benefits to regular citizens as well, or to public as well, whether it is medicines in the form of Ayurveda, whether it is even for your cosmetics, etc., where the natural treatments are far better than the synthetic ones, or it could be anything else. I mean, I'm just saying that in such a case, the rights are important, but it should be balanced, not just with the human rights of the communities, but overall, because there's a lot nature can offer to us, which we should tap into. And it's all about, so the thing is not just putting on a very rigid conservation process in terms of legislation or whatever, but rather how can we bring in legislation which will cover it at the same time allow you to use it. I mean, the example which comes to me is almost like, like it's akin to plastics today. I mean, plastic waste is considered a huge problem today, and plastic is pointed as a villain, but people should realize plastic is really good. In fact, if you do the life cycle assessment, plastic is far better than glass or metal in terms of the environmental, overall environmental sustainability. However, it is the management of the waste which is a problem, which if done properly, things can be. And that same principle applies, in my opinion, here. If it is managed properly, the nature rights can be protected, as well as it can be used beneficially for the entire people around the world. Yeah. So that's where I would like to stop at this point.
I really like the way you put that, because it isn't necessarily a contradiction, right? We can have sustainable use of our resources, and we can also respect the rights of nature. They're not necessarily opposing viewpoints, even though they're often presented that way. And while you're the lone industry member, you are an important voice in this discussion, and it's really part of the Echo Network's philosophy to make sure that everybody's voice is represented. And I know you mentioned indigenous viewpoints, and Maureen we have here, but I'm not sure if her sound is working yet. So I actually think I'd like to take the topic to Constanza. We also have a question about the effective implementation of the law. And actually, Constanza, you're coming from the Earth Law Center, and I actually would like you to talk about what are the working models for the rights of nature, and also, how maybe they can be used to resolve this issue of effective implementation that was asked in our chat. And thank you for being here as well.
Hi, thank you for the invitation. I'm very honored to be here. Yeah, I find this question a little tricky at the beginning, because when we are planning to implement this right of nature, we are thinking in big, like reform and do a transformative change of paradigm, So when we see the current model, sometimes we are not in that stage yet to create an harmonic relationship with nature of all the actors can align in new values in our legislation or economic level. So at the beginning, when I face this question, I say, well, what really are these working models? But answering this question, I will focus in which are the models who not only recognize right of nature, but also enjoy of a sufficient systematization to be applied in their context and have been applied in comparative experience. I think even though are more than 170 legal provisions that recognize right of nature, we can say only 2 or 3 models are really like fully working or doing a lot of effort to be implemented, I will say probably the Ecuadorian constitutional model are one of them, who recognize like nature as a whole have right of nature, recognize all citizens can act in favor of nature, have a standing to recognize nature, and have nature has intrinsic rights, recognize intrinsic right of nature, and also the model of New Zealand, who is a different approach, more centered in governance, recognize personhood in a specific ecosystem. But I think both models are working because first are legal models. I think one in constitution, one in an act, so have an legal system supporting them in terms of budget, in terms of institution, and have enough time of working like more than a decade. So we are seeing like results. Both have different approach, but both are being progressively working on time. Also, we are seeing results like citizens are using these systems, like their institutions are working, like creating or advancing or progressing in these approaches. Like judges have been trained, for example, in Ecuador. People are using their legal action, court are applying these actions. So we are seeing like results in Ecuador, for example, until 2022, more than like 35 actions have been filed for right of nature, and more than 80% of the actions have been held in favor of right of nature. So we see like a real progress, and also some of the specific laws have been aligned around the constitution. Of course, we are not like perfect. Of course, we are not seeing like the big change of paradigm yet, but we see, for example, this model. Now we are talking in the UN, we are talking in the IUCN about right of nature. So they are working because they're influencing like the international level too. So I think that is why also are working.
Constanza, I really appreciate that you also talked a little bit about the fact that these are actually models in practice. I know Kamal mentioned this too, this idea of the rights of nature. It's not new. It may be new to some people in our audience. You know, it was something that came to me through a story about, you know, making a lake a person in my, you know, my home country where you are right now, the US. So for me, even though I'm an ecologist, I wasn't so familiar with this issue, but it actually is an ongoing practiced strategy for many countries and many localities. And Craig, I'd actually like to come to you for this question. You know, since you actually have such experience, as I said earlier in our practice session, that you wrote a book on the subject. So what better person to come to? So maybe could you kind of follow up on Constanza's point and talk about some of these practical ways which we can actually address the rights of nature, not only from things already in practice, like Constanza mentioned, but maybe for other countries, other localities to start thinking about this issue in their local areas?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'd like to, I guess, make a few comments that tie in to a couple of the threads of discussion we've had. You know, I think it's, so first, I run a project called the Eco Jurisprudence Monitor that tracks these initiatives around the world. And I just, before we got on, I checked, and we've been able to verify there are currently 339 rights of nature initiatives in 32 countries, and the number grows every day. So and so in that sense, that's one way of measuring the effectiveness, or which is just sort of the sheer growth in the sort of the willingness or desire of people to think about and pursue these. And that, I think that matters a lot, because like when people ask me about measuring effectiveness, it's going to be a while before we can measure it in terms of ecological changes, because those happen on a long time scale and implementation has been short so far. But and also it's not like we're talking about massive paradigm change, so that's not a process that happens very quickly. And so I think one could argue we're seeing the effectiveness of some of these approaches just in the sheer growth in the mass mobilization behind these new ideas. So I just wanted to put that out there. So if I understood your question, there are a bunch of different models. There's many different ways you could structure rights of nature. There are also many different pathways by which people are trying to implement rights of nature principles within some structure that has authority to affect behavior, right? Because as Dr. Siva Kumar said, really it's about managing our behaviors as humans in a way that allows ecosystems to keep functioning. And the most famous examples, Ecuador and New Zealand, resulted from fairly unique windows of opportunity that opened up around the writing of a new constitution in the case of Ecuador, and treaty settlements in New Zealand. And so those probably aren't super replicable, but that's okay, because one of the things that I've learned is that there are a number of different pathways by which you can get these principles, rights of nature principles, put into action. And the best approach really varies from place to place, depending on the political and institutional and cultural context. So just to give you some examples, in the United States where I am, the nature of our political and institutional system is that it's just plagued by gridlock, and you would never get anything passed through the legislature. And so people are they're bypassing the legislature and going straight to citizens and making appeals to citizens. And we can do that because the US allows for ballot initiatives where citizens can create law on their own. And so there are literally hundreds of these across the United States, which gives you sort of a testament to the success in mobilizing that kind of public support. In other places, Colombia, India, Bangladesh, as was mentioned earlier, you have courts taking action on their own. In some cases, judges strategically interpreting existing laws to justify the underlying principles that are consistent with ecological law, sometimes merging them with other rights that are already recognized, like human environmental rights and indigenous cultural rights, through this concept of biocultural rights. And in those countries, that can happen because you have, public interest litigation in India, or tutelas in Colombia and other Latin American countries that give individual citizens a pathway for accessing the courts. And then in other places like Australia and some other places, advocates are just simply working directly with policymakers in the executive branches of city councils or regulatory agencies, training these people to be aware and understand rights of nature principles so that they can then incorporate these upfront in the decision making, which arguably, may be much more effective than waiting until there's a violation and then trying to claim a right has been violated and go to the courts and get it adjudicated and so forth. And so personally, I find that approach one of the more exciting developments. And so I would just say, for people who are interested in this, you find the pathway that's best suited to your political institutional context. And then it matters what kind of framing you use to sort of frame rights of nature, because it has to be done in a way that's salient for the local culture. So in the United States, this is done by framing rights of nature as a way to enhance local democracy, because you expand the notion of what the community is to include non-human members of the community of life, and then write the laws such that the local community members have the authority to determine how ecosystems are used. And that's framed as sort of strengthening local democracy, which is a framing that's strong in the United States and has the advantage of overcoming partisan divides that often, whereas in other places, and particularly in indigenous communities, it may be framed as a way of protecting sacred natural sites. This is a framing that's often used in Africa, or recovering ancestral knowledge, or strengthening kinship ties to the land, or what have you. And so I'll leave it at that.
That was a fantastic. I also appreciate the teaching moment that you just provided, which was wonderful to give an overview of some of the ways that these ideas are being implemented. And I also appreciate, because you also answered the question that's in the chat, which was talking about the lowest levels of hierarchy, because you really brought it down all the way from constitutional level, Constanza mentioned this, but all the way down to local communities and how they can implement it, even without having the laws behind them, right? Just going
Right.
through their own community interventions. So I really appreciated that nice overview. And you also mentioned indigenous rights, and I really hope that Maureen can hear us. I don't know if she's here. Maureen, are you there? Her audio has not been working, and we've been trying desperately in the background to get her audio to work. All right, I hope that she'll be able to come on a little bit, because I really would like to hear her perspective. It's very important. But in the meantime, I'll go back to Constanza, because you straddle the North and the South, right? You're in New York, but you also you represent Latin American studies, and Craig gave a lot of examples from South America, from Oceania, from Africa, and I'd like to hear from your perspective, what do you see as the differences between the global North and the global South? We hear this as a discussion. In some ways, I think there aren't differences, but there certainly are in other ways, and I'd really like to hear your perspective on this, maybe differences or similarities between the two hemispheres.
Yeah, it's hard to talk for me global North in terms of right of nature, because for example, United States, it has been probably the origin of the rate of nature, like a more contemporary, or the introduction in the Western law of this conception. However, there are, for example, in the United States, local ordinance, but for example, in Europe, still debating more of this initiative, have been very successful to introduce in the legal system yet, even though are still in debating, or started debating. So for global North, I will reduce more my analysis to maybe Canada or the United States. What I see them first, a counterintuitive. We think maybe we see a lot of initiative or success, for example, in Latin America, but we can see the most quantity of initiative we can see in the United States. That is very surprising for me, and I check in the tool Craig mentioned it before. In eco jurisprudence, you can check the United States have an amazing quantity of initiative that is incredible, local initiative. So that is, for example, really amazing. More of that is different with, for example, the South, probably because in numbers, the United States have maybe the most quantity of initiative. Maybe not all are successful, but we see still part of the origin of the movement. I see a difference in also the motivation. For example, as Craig said, the motivation for why we are adopting right of nature, probably we can see a difference in the South and in the North. In the United States, like Craig said, even though some of these initiatives have path in tribal law, there are also other kind of motivation, like more to strengthen the participation of the communities and open the way for democracy, for example. And in the South, we can see more relationship with concretize this relationship with indigenous people, or also clearly a motivation against the capitalist system, for example. In Ecuador, Bolivia, even in the movement in Chile, you can see that, or more clearly for conservation. For example, in Panama, we talk more about that. In that, also we see difference in the way how you concretize right of nature. In Latin America, probably has been how crazy more open windows to introduce directly in the national legal system, like in the frameworks, like constitution, like general laws, and have been like laws who are mandatory for all citizens. So of course they have more strength for the people and have been more concrete. In this application, for example, Ecuador, now Panama, we can see a lot of initiatives trying to create the path for implement this right. And also, I can see, for example, in the South, a more clear or more open relationship between right of nature and spirituality. For example, in Ecuador, in New Zealand, even maybe the Chilean constitution or the draft were more neutral, but they openly trying to show this relationship between the spiritual side or the indigenous people spirituality and Mother Earth, for example. And I think in the north of the experience in, for example, the local ordinance are more neutral in language, have other probably objectives. And also in the south, I see it's more clear the relationship between human rights, indigenous rights, more in constitutional levels or international law and right of nature, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, that reflects a lot of, historical and cultural differences as well. And I mean, this is kind of a broad question, right? Because you can't even lump anything in the hemisphere together, right? And you brought that up, and so did Craig in his previous answer about, honestly, every country, every locality has to address this issue based on their own ecological, cultural, social, economic histories, and I appreciate you giving that viewpoint. Abhiraj, Constanta just mentioned this idea of how we, different cultures, different societies have different relationships with nature, and I wanted to really come back to you. So how do you see this idea of the rights of nature helping us to change how we think about nature and the world? This theme has been really running through all of the discussions up to this point, but also it was brought up at the very beginning that we have to, and you brought it up about changing our lifestyle and overconsumption. So how do you see these concepts really playing out and helping us to live more sustainably? Sustainable consumption is something that Siva mentioned as well.
Thanks very much. So I think, in some sense, these threads have appeared already in some of the comments from my co-panelists. I'm seeing the paradigm change occurring at least 4 fundamental levels, and I'll very quickly outline those. I think first, and for me, the most important is the paradigm change from one of hubris and arrogance, right? In some sense, that we are the most important species or form of life or story, if you wish, to one where a certain humility comes in, right? And in some sense, a certain acknowledgement comes in that we are part of a interrelated story, a multi-species story, an intergenerational mineral, plant, animal, spiritual kinship story, right? And that is, for me, the most profound transformative paradigm that can, be ushered in through the Rights for Nature movement, because once that happens, really most other things, including how we consume, how we travel, what we eat, what we wear, how we build our settlements, how we carry out scientific research, how we organize industry, everything gets affected by that, right? And I think following closely on the heels of that first big point about the place of humans in history and in the world and in ecology, if you wish, would be just sort of very clearly looking at this narrative around growth, right? And asking the question of, do we really need those crazy magic numbers of GDP growth, right? And I think, with all due respect to narratives of sustainable development and the need for a balance, etc., the reality is that even as GDP figures go up, inequality within human populations also goes up, right? So you have these very often cited figures of the 1% of the world having as much as the bottom 70%, so on and so forth. So for me, the Rights of Nature movement really gets us to once again ask, do we need this kind of consumptive, extractive, contaminating, polluting growth? Can we even call this growth, or is this growth in the model of a cancerous, malignant, devastating growth, right? And I think that's the second paradigm change that comes in, and you're beginning to see countries that are embracing rights for nature and their laws also seeing ripple effects in their economic deliberations and overall policy imaginations of what it means to be developed or what it means to have a growth story. I think third, and in some sense, a point which I think has not come up so far is, once one has rights, one must have responsibilities, right? And I think that's one of the fundamental conceptions of jurisprudence. You can't have a right holder without a duty holder. And this really forces the answer to the question of, okay, the Ganga or the Yamuna or a saltwater lagoon in Spain or the Amazon in South America has rights, but who has the duty that corresponds to that right? Right? And you're beginning to see innovative models, you're beginning to see hybrid institutions, you're beginning to see very creative juxtaposition of policy, science, and customary knowledge, right? In new arenas, new forums, new spaces of decision making. And last and final point, I'll wind up with this, the last paradigm change related to the first one. And
maybe no video.
Glad to see Maureen finally has appeared. Hi, Maureen, we can see you and hear you finally. So the last point I wanted to share was the paradigm change of reaffirming, in some sense, the moral and intellectual superiority of indigenous knowledge systems, right? Because if there have been communities and ways of life who have always known this, who have always lived in this way, who have done exactly what 200 countries agreed to do very recently in Montreal at the Biodiversity COP 15, right? Agreed to affirm the rights of nature. What does that say to the sort of epistemic violence that we've enacted on indigenous knowledge systems, right? And it tilts that paradigm to once again, in some sense, reify the indigenous wisdom that we have forgotten. So I think those are the different ways in which this can really get us to take everything differently, nothing less than, as we walk, having kinship with the ground beneath our feet, having almost a sacred relationship, if, like Constanza said, we embrace that spiritual dimension to our role in this web of life.
Abe, that was so beautifully put, and there were so many nuggets of information about that, and really particularly this idea of change and who has to change, which is actually us. And Craig, I'm going to come back to you about behavioral change, but since we finally have the beautiful Maureen with us, I'm so happy that we have figured out a way to connect with her. And you mentioned the importance of Indigenous peoples in this conversation and their perspectives and their cultures. So, and this is really Maureen's expertise and why we have asked her to come to the panel today. So I hope you can hear me, Maureen, and welcome. And I'm so glad we finally got you online. And I'd really like to ask you, we've been talking about various paradigms for rights of nature, different practices, law-based actions versus community-based actions. And I would like to really ask you in particular, because we've been bringing up the importance of Indigenous practices, Indigenous thinking, Indigenous histories and cultures in this conversation. So how do you see the rights of nature as a pathway for recognizing Indigenous laws and practices, or perhaps impinging upon them? There might be a backlash as well. And I'd really love to hear from you on this. And I'm so glad you're here. I was so happy you joined. In the meantime, I think while she's connecting, I will take the conversation back to Craig. I mentioned you before. Abe just so beautifully talked about, the need for change at an individual level, at a national level, how we think about things like GDP going forward. So I'd like to hear from you about the importance of behavioral change in this discussion, and what does that mean, and what is that going to entail for us at different levels of society, for us here in India, for you in the US, for different countries in all of the continents across this globe.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really great question. I think the way I want to I could answer that a number of ways, but I think the way I want to answer it will sort of tie into previous comments about sort of how we balance human development needs and rights of nature. In my mind, one of the biggest, first off, I want to say that in my mind, like, rights of nature isn't the end goal itself. It's just a tool to get that hopefully can help us get to the paradigm and systems change that Abi described so well. And it's not the only way you could do that, right? So there are other models that are more responsibilities based, that takes our responsibilities framing, like ecocide or protecting sacred natural sites and so forth. But one of the important elements of the underlying rights of nature framework that I think really differentiates it from sort of conventional wisdom and conventional approaches is that it recognizes that humans are not separate and apart from nature, and it takes a systems view, first of all, right? It recognizes that the natural world is not a bunch of independent stocks of resources that can be taken and used in different ways without affecting the whole. But rather it's a set of nested systems of which we humans are part. And therefore, human well-being is dependent upon the well-being of the systems that we're a part of, right? And this matters for how we conceptualize sustainable development, because the conventional approach to sustainable development pretends that there are these three spheres that are each independent and autonomous, that there's sort of the natural sphere, the economic sphere, and the social sphere, right? And it sort of assumes that these are all, and sustainable development happens in the Venn diagram where the three overlap. Any ecologist, right, will tell you that's not actually how the world really works. That nature is the only system that is truly independent and autonomous. Social systems can only function to the extent that it has access to functioning natural systems. We need clean air, we need clean water, we need soil that we can grow food, all right? And then similarly, ecosystem or economic systems are social constructions, right? And they only exist as to the extent that you have a stable social system. So in wartime, when social systems break down, economies are the first things to go, essentially. And so that shows us that the sustainable development model, as conventionally portrayed, is deeply flawed and erroneous, and is probably perpetuating problematic systems and actions. And that in reality, these three spheres should be understood as concentric circles, where economic systems are nested within social systems, which are nested within natural systems. So when we talk about balance, I mean, we have to just sort of understand that, yeah, humans are going to always need to take things from, use parts of nature to survive. Again, we are part of the system. So this is not a conservation approach, right? Where you wall off nature and there's no human interaction. There's an assumption that humans are part of the ecosystems and we're going to impact them. But the point is that it is illogical and self-destructive to prioritize, to destroy the ecosystems that you're dependent on, to prioritize, economy to the point where it overwhelms or damages the ability for social systems to function. And it's similarly illogical and self-destructive to prioritize social systems to the point where the natural systems that they depend on get overwhelmed and can no longer regenerate their cycles and cannot function. And so that is, in my mind, one of the biggest sort of aspects of the paradigm change that impacts how we rethink systems and what it means to actually balance, right? And it doesn't mean that so as Dr. Sivakumar said earlier, it really does come down to then how we manage our behaviors, right? But the key there is, and I think someone else made this point earlier, which is really important, is that nature is so complex that it's beyond humans' ability to fully comprehend the systems. And so it's, I think, naive and arrogant in its self-destructive way to think that we could ever manage nature to try to bend it to human will. And instead, we need to redesign systems to manage human behaviors to fit and adapt to the natural systems that we're embedded in and on which we depend for the conditions for life.
I think you're absolutely right, and as an ecologist, I can only agree about this complexity of nature. And nature, I mean, a plant or a tree or a frog doesn't go around thinking of its socioeconomic status in the environment, but what it does is it tries to survive as best it can in the midst of all this complexity. And it does take that complexity into account through various biological mechanisms, and this idea that it's not to understand the full complexity of the system, but finding our niche in it. And you mentioned Siva as well, and that requires actually regulation at different levels. And so this is really your expertise from the industry side. So I'd really like to come back to you. We bookended. You were much earlier in the conversation, and now here again. But I'd like to think from the industry perspective, right? When we're talking about all of these different strategies that we've heard today, and then thinking about how do we regulate this at the industry level to ensure that we are utilizing the natural resources to the extent that we need to for our survival and our own human prosperity, but also retaining the prosperity of our natural systems so that they are sustained for us. Because as Craig said, these are not Venn diagrams of separate issues, they're all one issue. So I'd really like to hear from you about this perspective, and especially from the regulatory standpoint.
So I think regulations are needed. Let's put it, I mean, let's be honest here. I mean, if you let industry, I'm from the industry, but if you don't have any regulations, industry can run wild here. So let's be clear on that. Regulations are needed, but again, the theme at the cost of reiterating, it has got to be a balanced regulation. It's got to be a pragmatic regulation. Yeah, it's got to be steeped in reality. You cannot just think that what is the utopian way of living and then we have regulations framed to get there. It's not going to happen. Today the world has changed. 200 years ago, yes, men, probably human beings, lived with nature, or 500 years ago lived with nature, but that's not going to happen today. It's all changed. And probably for the worse, but it's changed. Yeah, that's a reality today. Professor Abhay was saying, is should we run after GDP? Countries will run after GDP, right? I mean, that's how the system has become. So let's face it, might not be ideal, but this is what it is. And then so the regulation should reflect that. So it cannot be and and measures have to be taken, and the industry has a responsibility in this as well, in terms of how do we do it. So for example, if there are areas where I mean, for example, sustainable from an industry point of view, give an example, sustainable use of palm, for example, it's talked about a lot. How do we do that? How do we make sure, have everybody uses NDP palm, right? No destruction, no peat, no human exploitation. The industry has to own these kind of measures to supplement or augment the regulation. So the Biodiversity Act is a great example in India. It's one of the most stringent acts globally on biodiversity. Even if you use a small leaf, or bark is at least somewhat more unsustainable, but a leaf or a root, for example, or a branch, you have to pay, the industry has to pay benefit sharing. I'm saying, yeah, but fine, which is good, which you should have some amount of response from the industry as well. But then what are you talking about? I mean, is it an endangered species? Is this commonly grown? Is a cultivated crop which is annually you can regenerate as much as you want? And if there are endangered species, are we, and that is being used by industry for various purposes, whether it's medicines or whether it is cosmetics or any other application, can we cultivate those? I mean, measures have to be put in, and industry has to partner the government. Government can't do this all alone. So industry has to do this. Maybe spend money on education. In general, even common man. I mean, while industry is there, if you look at in India, go on the street, look at common. Nobody cares really. I mean, they're all looking at their own development. They want the money. They want to have the comforts of life. It's like saying, there's so much emissions. This carbon emission is so high. Stop using cars. Stop using AC. Nobody's going to do that, right? Everybody wants to. In fact, more and more people want to get in. Nobody's going to go to horse carriage and bullock cart, which will obviously help matters. But I'm saying that's the reality. So the regulations have to be in that space. It has to be practical. It has to make sure that there is enough deterrent to ensure that industry or anybody else for that matter doesn't completely what do you call, use up the entire ecosystem and make it bare, but rather sustainable use. How do you do that? What kind of measures do you want to keep in place is something which I think the government has to think through. Today, the biodiversity Act I'm talking about, because I know that, and Sharon, we have been talking about this as well, is too much. I mean, it cannot be this way. I mean, it simply doesn't allow the industry to transfer the benefits of nature to the consumers, which is actually a real need actually. At the same time, I do want the regulation in place to make sure industry doesn't completely use up the entire nature without any conservation. So it's got to be a balance which needs a lot of thought, lot of research has to be done, which Eco Network is doing right now. How do you value a bioresource? How do you value any of the the rivers, etc.? Stringent measures, regulations in terms of pollution. I mean, you look at India today, the Yamuna River is, I don't know, it's nobody, I don't want to touch the river. I mean, it's that polluted, right? Who is responsible? The industry is responsible. They're putting all the effluents, etc., into the river, which there should be some. The other point is about regulation is one thing to frame an act and rules, but one thing to execute and make sure that it's enforced, right? That mechanism is also quite weak. At least in India, it is weak. You have acts, you have rules, but then it is not enforced properly, in which case it's there but people still flout the rules and keep doing things they're doing. And then as Craig mentioned, then the judiciary, the NGT for example, has to get step in and pass an order, which then becomes like suddenly it's as a big deal as to what is to be done, kind of thing. So main point, it has to be balanced, practical, steeped in reality. It has to be enforced strongly, otherwise the rules and act don't mean anything.
Thank you, Sivakumar, also for bringing up this idea of balance, that there's no, and I think this is what we've been covering through this whole discussion so far, is that there's no one answer. There's no, it's not as if the rights of nature is going to solve every problem we have out there. There's different mechanisms that have to be placed. And I think originally when we thought about this, we were going to ask you this kind of naive question about, should nature have rights? But I actually don't think this is the right question to ask at this point, because I think that's not really the issue. And we've talked about this balance. I've heard all of you talk about balance in one way or another. Balance between different rights, balance between laws, balance between regulation, balance between humans and nature. And so I think I'd like to hear from each of you at this point, rather, what needs to happen to achieve this balance, because we've heard all of these mechanisms and you mentioned them all, and I'd like to hear from each of you in your views, like how do we achieve this balance, whether it's by utilizing the tenets of the rights of nature, utilizing current laws, amending laws. Maria mentioned some of the acts in India that you feel need to be amended. What is it that we need to be doing at this point, and also for all of our audience members, what can we take away, what can we advocate for, what can we do in our homes and our communities, and maybe even through pressuring decision makers, pressuring industry, or just doing things on our own, as Craig mentioned earlier in the conversation with our community members. I'd really like to hear from all of you their thoughts on this. I actually don't know if Kamal is still here, or if he has left the chat, but I'd like to hear from Kamal as well if he's available. But I don't know who wants to start. If you're ready, it's a big question I'm asking you. So maybe Abe, if I can go to you first. I mean, how do we move forward?
Thank you. So I think for me, how we move forward is by experimenting with models at different scales, with equal importance being given to the the most local or grounded level experiment, as well as the largest global experiment. And I think, I mean, one can't just end with the experiment, but in some sense, an evaluation and assessment of how a rights of nature, legal, policy, and administrative regime plays out on terms of all of these metrics and indicators that we value for our own evaluation of whether something is efficient or feasible or good, broadly speaking, right? Which might be the environmental benefits, the economic feasibility, the overall long-term possibilities, right? So going to the heart of what Echo Network has been working on for a long time as well, which is the valuation approach to these questions. So I think that for me is what we start with. We really, let's take a particular legal regime or a country. You see what happens when a particular ecosystem, let's say a particular river basin, right, is governed by and is regulated by a rights for nature approach. So I'll just pause there. I also think there's someone at my door trying to gain admittance, and I'll open it up for other panelists.
The perils of doing a live session remotely. You have people coming to your door. Constanza, maybe I'll come to you now. How do we address this issue?
Yeah, I think when you talk about balance, I agree with Avi in terms of when he said about experiment, like experiencing in new models. Also, I think it's capital for do that and have a new standard and have results and measure all these results. Probably start like bringing professional, other kind of professional to this framework or this cosmovision of right of nature. I think it's capital for the movement to include like scientists to really want to sign in this movement, because, for example, one thing I think has been very interesting for the Erlo Center in the latest project we have is start working with scientists in biology. So we start talking with them about how we see nature. So their perspective also in taking the measure, for example, of the ocean, of what, for example, turtle need, change also what they're looking in their measures. And so I think if we can talk with them about what we are looking for, like reestablish the balance, about like we're looking to see what nature needs, or what are the level of to establish also our or see what is the measure to make the earth, or for example the sun or a river healthy. Maybe also the scientists can understand what are the standards we are looking for, and also can be translated in a legal standard or in a regulation, you see, and can change everything. Now, sometimes a legal standard and related on what is the minimal of pollution, and not really what is the minimal for make environment to thrive or flourish, you know. So I think it's capital to have to achieve the balance of what Avi said, like also include other perspective, like scientists, but also industry, also politicians. We need all of us, of the society, include in this perspective. We cannot be like a bunch of legal staff or only indigenous people. We want to all have harmony with nature, and that means all of us, not only some people or only the ecosystem. I think that is the starting point.
Thank you, Stanza. And also, I'm deeply appreciative as a scientist for you bringing up the importance of science in this discussion, because I think it's often talked about as more of a social, economic, legal issue. But science, of course, plays a role in just understanding those ecosystem services and their valuation. And as you said, you know, the minimum levels of, you know, contamination, pollution, effect that humans have on the environment, that needs to also be incorporated in these discussions. So yeah, thank you for that. Craig, how about you? How should we move forward in this discussion?
There's so many things I would want to say. So I guess one thing I will say is, you know, Costanza's exactly right, which is to say, I mean, the rights of nature is just a framework of principles for how we should design systems. But of course, we're talking about paradigm change and massive restructuring in all kinds of systems, whether it's energy systems, economic systems, and social systems, and so forth. And so it really does need a very interdisciplinary approach to put it into practice. And I think that is sort of the next, I feel like that's where the movement is right now. You know, increasingly the moral arguments or the philosophical arguments, people are open and are more accepting to that. But I talk with policymakers a lot who are like, look, I buy the moral argument, but I don't know what to do with this in this particular policy field. And so more work needs to be done on thinking about regulatory criteria. Some really important work on this is happening, ironically, by Ecuador's Constitutional Court, which are, for political reasons, you know, that these kinds of detailed regulations should be being done through like the Ministry of Environment and other government executive branch ministries, but they're just not doing it. And so it's been left to the Constitutional Court of Ecuador, who's then partnering with scientists and indigenous peoples who understand the ecosystems that they're embedded in, to develop sort of regulatory frameworks for how you would recognize when violations of rights of nature exist, and therefore restoration, you know, therefore you have the responsibility or duty of restoration to restore the ability for the cycles to generate and adapt and evolve naturally and so forth. So training policymakers is important. You know, working with scientists and local communities, indigenous and non-indigenous alike, training judges to think about, and then just doing the hard work of, because every ecosystem is unique, right? To try to start sort of mapping and understanding what it would mean to create regulatory frameworks that are based on the natural rules for how ecosystems function. And so that's a lot of work there to do. I do want to say, I guess, one, and then equally important is to listen to economists who are developing new frameworks for ecological economics, because we are going to have to rethink our our economic systems. And I respectfully disagree that we're inevitably locked into using GDP as the criteria. Talking about local experiments, there are alternatives. For example, I'm thinking of the genuine progress indicator, which has been put forth as an alternative to the GDP. It's similar to the GDP in many ways, but it accounts for negative externalities like pollution, biodiversity loss, exacerbating climate change. And so just simply does a better job of sort of measuring, are you doing good or are you doing bad overall, not just in terms of how much can you produce and consume, but what is the overall impact on sort of natural and social systems. And there are a number of cities in the United States that for city and state planning are moving to the genuine progress indicator because they're having to adapt to climate change. And frankly, they really do want to know, they want to be able to track, are they doing better or worse? And they're beginning to realize GDP is not useful for that, really.
And also, when we talk about, you've heard a few times also Siva mentioned that we're, our network's working on this idea of ecosystem valuation, which is what many, many, many organizations across the world and scientists and others, economists have worked on. And you brought this up, that the term valuation isn't an economic one. It actually has to bring in lots and lots of different perspectives. And how do you bring those into the formulation? How do you bring cultural services of our ecosystems into that conversation, which don't necessarily have monetary value, but have enormous value from a societal perspective? There's a lot of aspects of our ecosystems that are not easily put into a currency or a GDP or any sort of economic model that we use. So I think that was a very important point you made. But Siva, you were the one that brought up GDP. So I want you to be able to respond to this and also, talk about how are we going to move forward with this concept? You also mentioned this idea of, some regulation, but we can't over-regulate and that there has to be a balance. And so I'd really like to hear from you, how are we going to achieve this balance?
Okay, so I don't want to say too much about GDP. That's not the point of discussion anyway. But the point is that what Craig mentioned is happening in Europe and the US, but developing countries don't think that way, right? So there is always developing countries like India or China probably will say, well, you already done your part, let us do our part. That's happening, right? Whether it is emissions or whatever, like India, for example, has said net zero by 2070 or 2050. So it's not possible because that's how the system is. Whether I agree with you, we should go to the progress indicator GPI rather than GDP, but it's going to take a lot of time. Anyway, coming to your original question, what should we do? I think I agree with Constance. All the stakeholders have to come together, right? So there's government, there is industry, there's academia, maybe the consumer NGOs, and there is institutions, etc. And the citizens themselves should come together. And typically, I look at two examples. One is the plastic waste problem, which gained lot of significance in India, and then currently the climate change, the carbon emissions, which is happening. The government came out in the plastic case. The government came out and put out. They started by saying we'll ban plastics, right? That was kind of a major issue because without plastic life can't be imagined today. It take a long time to get to an alternatives of plastic which is viable, which is economically viable, which is even from an environment point of view is nothing is as good as plastic when it comes to overall. But there is a clear genuine problem in terms of plastic waste, littering, clogging rivers and canals, etc. So the government came, said then industry, academia, everybody jumped in saying, no, this is not the way to do. And then suddenly industry came up with technologies to move away from the multi-layer packaging, which is non-recyclable. They're moving away from multi-layer, going to mono-layer. which initially nobody thought of, but the science part again comes in, where technology was developed. Recycling of plastics, the government started getting into action in terms of setting up, picking up, using rack pickers in India to pick up plastics, recycle these. There are startups which put up plants to take this plastic, convert them into good quality, which now industry is reusing in their packaging rather than taking virgin plastic. Things are moving beautifully, right? So hopefully and companies have put on commitments, industries are putting commitment by 2025, all our plastic will be recyclable, we will collect more plastic than what we put in, etc. I'm saying the whole movement has started, and hopefully in another, say, 5-6 years, this plastic problem should not be there, and there will be enough ways to tackle it rather than banning plastic. So it started with, and regulations are in place, right? So regulation is still in place, but they have been amended to make sure that it is practical and it is, it's something which will still ensure that there is no plastic waste problem. Similarly, the carbon emissions, the government came out and said out saying by 2017, I'm talking about India because I know India quite well. Others also might have similar process. They said by 2070 we will be net zero emissions. By 2030 we'll reduce 1 billion tons of carbon emission. Once they did that, there are a lot of things happening now. A lot of sustainable energy sources are coming. Electric vehicles are again being brought out in large, instead of using fossil fuel, you're coming up with electric vehicles which will cut down on the pollution. Solar energy, wind energy. There's a lot of people have green hydrogen. I mean, you're suddenly seeing industry coming up with technologies, government incentivizing people with, with benefits. There are carbon credits, there are benefits. For example, these new technologies are more expensive, but then you give enough incentive to get them to a scale where it becomes comparable. All this is happening, and that's exactly what needs to happen with the natural resources ecosystem. The government has to come up with a commitment, bring in regulate. There are some regulations, but I'm saying a practical regulation. The industry pitches in, starts using technology to see how best to efficiently to utilize. How do you, if you're like in the case of, you use some of the bioresources, you plant somewhere else, make sure that make a commitment, the forest cover has to go up by 10%. I'm just giving in top of my head some commitment like that, then automatically things start falling in place. Academics will ensure how to value, institutions like yours will come up with what is the right valuation, how do we do this. But somebody has to take the lead and start with a, for lack of better word, a dictatorial approach. Well, this is the regulation, you can't do. Then suddenly everybody pitches in saying, no, let's do this, we will do this, we will do that. Otherwise nobody moves into action. Once that happens, I'm pretty sure this can be tackled. I mean, that seems the only logical way to me where things will move. Otherwise it's all theoretical, it will be in discussions, there will be opposition. If the industry cannot meet the regulation, they will go to court. Courts will hold it for years, it will go on, the cases will go on. So that, I think it has to be a practical, all of us have to come in. Training, I mean, training and education of common man is very critical, right? So you start at the grassroots level, you start in the schools itself. Once the children get to know all this, when they grow up, they become ambassadors for conservation and for sustainable use, etc. So I mean, sorry it took some time, but that I think is how I believe which we should go about.
Thank you very much. I'd like to just remind our audience that you can please ask questions. I hope, I mean, we've talked about so many issues. You must have lots of questions out there, and we're going to come to them very shortly. So I would like to hear from you. I can see lots of thumbs up and happy signs coming up. So I know there's a lot of you there. So I'd love to hear your questions. We'll be taking them in just a minute. So you also mentioned, this idea that we have to start, and I think one of the nice things that I've heard from all of you today is that there is a capacity for change and for adaptation. We're seeing this so rapidly. You mentioned in industry, the transfer to things like renewable energy and things like that has really changed very rapidly, and it has gained momentum in a relatively short period of time. So these other types of changes that have been mentioned, increasing capacity, increasing discussions, cross-sector discussions and cross-sector implementation techniques, all of these things are 100% possible and need to happen, and needed to happen yesterday. But better they happen at least at some point. So with that said, we really appreciate the RISE format, which is intended actually to drive this conversation forward. This is not intended to be a discussion that we just have today and you come on and we go, oh, nice talk, but we actually want to take your ideas forward. The Echo Network is committed to doing this in a number of ways, talking with communities about this issue over the next few months, also bringing it into our projects and platforms, and we hope that the audience members do this as well. So with that said, we need to start somewhere. So this is something that we always ask, and so mention this, the need to start. How do we start? What is the first thing we do? You mentioned so many different things that need to happen, and there are a lot of things that need to happen. So if I were to ask you, what is the next thing that you would do? If we get off the call today, what is the first thing we need to do to start realize some of these wonderful visions and hopes and dreams that you've presented, and also realities that are already happening on the ground in many places across the world? So what do we do first? I'll come to you, Craig, first with this question.
So I don't know what to do first. I think there's a lot of things that happen all at the same time, right? So, so your question just reminds me of things that I'm doing now. Dr. Sivakumar is absolutely right that really the first thing is educating, and especially educating young people. And so as a professor, I have the privilege of doing that, and I can tell you that for at least the youth that I interact with, these ideas seem very commonsensical to them. They are sort of unencumbered by, I guess, previous ideological biases that may make this seem strange. And so that's one of the things that does give me hope, generally, when I'm feeling discouraged, is just sort of the willingness and openness to envision and work towards new systems based on values that they see as sort of commonsensical, like I said. I also write amicus briefs to help train and educate judges. I am doing a bunch of radio interviews in support of a citizen campaign ballot initiative in my county here in Oregon.
Panel sessions.
Panel sessions. And then also thinking about picking specific policy issue areas, sort of like resilience. So like when cities are doing resiliency plans, what does a resiliency plan look like if you're designing it based on the fundamental principles of ecological law or ecological jurisprudence? In other words, if you're really trying to be resilient by adapting to the natural cycles of the ecosystems where you live. So those are the things that I'm working on.
So bringing various stakeholders into the conversation, making them aware of it, bringing awareness to the public, educating at various levels, from children all the way up to senior judges in the courts. Siva, how about you? Where should we start? You mentioned about we need to start. So what should we start with?
When you say we, you mean whom? Myself personally, or talking about in
Well,
general?
honestly, I think it was brought up earlier. It has to happen. Every single man, woman, child of any gender, of any background has to tackle this issue. This is a worldwide issue. So, but we need to start in various ways, and we can mean you as an industry member, it can mean you as an individual, you as a family member yourself. I think this is an open question for all of us, for all of our audience members as well.
At an individual level, I mean, as part of my role in the industry, I make sure that the innovations I come up with use bioresources and other ecosystem responsibly. We make sure that we don't use ingredients which are endangered, and still, even though it might give a lot of benefit, it's not the right thing to do. There may be other ways to do it. The other one, both at the personal level, is my conviction, but at the same time, as part of the industry associations, work with organizations like yours, and then maybe some of the NGOs too, to maybe make a pitch to the government. I mean, we do a lot of advocacy proposals. For example, one of the things we are doing right now, HUL is leading that, Unilever is leading that, is in terms of using renewable carbon rather than using virgin fossil fuel to make carbon, which is used in a lot of these chemicals, which, because they are all embedded carbon which will be released as emissions. Like that, come up with a proposal, advocacy with the government on conserving and sustainably using the biosystem, actually grow the ecosystem from where it is depleted a lot, which is, everybody has said that it's a fact. Get the government to take this up as a serious issue along the lines of, I mean, it is also linked to the carbon emission, because these do act as a carbon sink, right? So in that sense, it is obviously critical even to meet the emission goals, maybe. But I'm saying, take this itself in as a separate thing to work on, and as a country, for the country, and set a commitment, and then get all the other stakeholders into it to achieve this. It can be done. I mean, once the government decides to do that, industry, academia, everybody will pitch in, and it can be done. And most important, I'm not dealing too much with students, but that's something which we can ask the schools, etc., to start having a, if not a, at least a subject on these, and start educating the young minds, so that when they grow up, they are automatically tuned into this, rather than some of us who are now adapting to it, because we do see the issue on hand. So
Absolutely. Awareness is such an important part of this conversation. Constanza, what about you? Where do we start? We writ large, we as the people of the planet who have to live with our nature around us.
Yeah, I think, well, as you said, everyone in the profession can contribute. Maybe I can talk like crazy, like everyone can talk about their starting point. Like in our center, we always ask ourselves like, what is the plan of the year? And every year is like a new commitment, I feel. So, for example, in the Latin American program this year, our commitment is work more probably in think about implementation. So, what mean this broad principle in practice? For a long time, I think the for practitioner who or for organization like the Erlo Center and others like start educating judges, like filing amicus curiae, like educating for us was so important. Like I say, like going to all the countries, start to send amicus curiae, educate people was so important. But I feel like we have to keep doing that, but also keep working, like I say, a little bit in going specific implementation law, and start working in what means like the right of nature more in the next level. Like I feel like our worlds become more and more complex, and like we as like a lawyer probably have to answer many questions sometimes to the legislator when they ask us. And like, for example, countries like Ecuador are advancing in this rate of nature, now Panama, and we are advancing with them. We need to think more in what mean in practice this law, and how we can contribute more, for example, in standards, and how we can work with other sectors or other alliance with scientists, or more with other indigenous people groups or other communities or sectors. So yeah, I think that is my challenge this year. Probably work in both sector, like in like continuing in the recognition of right of nature. In some of the country, we don't have like any legislation adopted, but also try to work in think more specifically what means right of nature in a deeper way in practice, legal tools, and yeah. to make our framework more complete and more applicable every day. Yeah, I think it's complex, but we're working on it.
I appreciate you also discussing that it's an evolving issue and you have to constantly reevaluate it. And I think this is a really important part of it, right? That you know, this is not something that's static where we just answer the question. This is what we call a wicked problem, right? It's not solvable in many ways. It changes as we go along. We have to adopt new strategies. And as we mentioned, the rights of nature is one of these strategies that has to be incorporated among many. Abhirash, over to you. Where do we start?
Thank you. I think I follow all of my co-panelists who have said it really depends on who the we is. And, you know, I think my sort of quick word on that is it also depends on the roles and audiences you have access to. As you yourself said, Shannon, there's no doubt that every job can and must be a climate job right now, right? And every role has the opportunity and potential to be a nature protector or a nature defender opportunity or situation. When it comes to me, I mean, for me, I see what we must do first, and this might again respectfully disagree with some of the perspectives that have come earlier. I think we really need to free the mind first. It's like that song, free the mind and the rest will follow. So I certainly don't believe we are locked into a particular paradigm of incrementalism, right? In fact, I would invoke, you know, the Black lesbian poetess Audre Lorde. The master's tools are never going to dismantle the master's house. So some market-based solutions, light touch regulation, really giving industry one more opportunity to take another 10 or 15 years is not the way to go forward. I think one has to really celebrate the alternatives, right? You have a pluriverse of possibility. I mean, I think Craig mentioned a beautiful alternative paradigm. You have in the South Asian region, you have Bhutan working with gross national happiness. You have conceptions of eco-swaraj, buen vivir. You have, you know, so many thriving transition towns, functioning systems where the rights of nature are taken into account. And so I think for me, holding that position in classrooms, in industry, in policy debates, right, is important for anyone to have the courage to even do the incremental stuff. I mean, if Justice William Douglas in the famous Sierra Club versus Morton case hadn't dissented, right? He was the one who dissented because he read the article that Dr. Bawa mentioned. Christopher Stone slipped him the article and he dissented and he said nature should have standing, right? The rest of the judges in the Supreme Court weren't thinking like that. And that really opened up a new era when one thinks about standing for nature. So I think, yeah, decolonizing the mind. There are other ways for us to function, and they exist today. They're not utopian to the extent that we can't achieve them. We just need to celebrate them. And I think the young people, Greta Thunberg being one example, have seen that. So they're calling it out as it is.
And I think that one of the ways of, I like this term, decolonizing the mind, is also listening. I think we don't do enough listening. We often stay in our little circles. I can say this as a scientist, we surely do, where we don't interact with these other viewpoints, especially the ones that are different from ours, that we might not inherently agree with. We have to have these open conversations and listen to these viewpoints if we're actually going to come to some sense of cohesion where we can actually work together. I mean, that's essentially what nature does, you know, going back to one of Craig's earlier points, you know, I mean, that's how nature works, and its complexity is it's always listening to the other organisms around, and we really need to do the same, and that's really what we're trying to do here today. We do have a few questions, so I'd like to, in the last few minutes, open to the questions that are in the chat. One of the questions, and it's an issue that hasn't been brought up by Mohammed, is about, you know, corruption, which actually undermines these efforts, you know, because, you know, we talk about regulation and laws and this, but also then there's abuse of these actions as well. I'm not sure who should take this question. I'm not sure if this is a question for you, Constanza, or maybe Craig to tackle this. But how do we deal with these sort of abuse issues, which we haven't talked up until now?
I can say something.
Please,
take a
yeah.
first stab at
Yeah.
that. I mean, the first thing is the problem of abuse and corruption is not unique to rights of nature, right? Like this is gonna be a problem anytime you have any human governance system. So this is just sort of the status quo. So we shouldn't. It would be erroneous or I would be problematic to say, oh, we shouldn't do this because there's the potential for abuse, because that exists constantly. So the real question is, how can you design rights of nature governance systems to try to at least protect against that? And I would say one of the advantages of the rights of nature framework, at least as so it depends a lot how you structure these things. We haven't really talked about this at all, but there are a lot of different ways you can structure rights of nature systems, and some of them have perverse negative incentives and some of them are better than others. But one of the things that's become clear, I think, is that it's not enough just to pass a law recognizing the rights. You then have to address issues of how will nature's interests and rights be represented in human governance institutions. Something that's often thought of as guardianship or custodianship, or right. And so I think there's a strong argument to be made that local communities that are present and have a long direct knowledge of particular ecosystems should participate in sort of these custodianship arrangements. And so you have to embed these custodianship arrangements in collaborative, integrated ecosystem management systems, essentially. And so the nature of these participatory, collaborative, integrated ecosystem management systems are that you're going to have checks on abuse and corruption, because the people who are closest to, well, I don't want to say closest, but people who have an interest in protecting the ecosystem have direct involvement in decision making up front. And so that you don't wait until there's a violation and then try to work through the courts to get restoration later.
And also distributed power and responsibility therein, and also some decentralization involved in the process as well. This is some issue that's talked about in many contexts, the importance of decentralization for a lot of strategies. Constanza, I brought your name up before. I didn't know if you wanted to comment as well on this.
Yeah, I kind of follow what Chris said, and also I want to say, for example, Latin America, there are new treaty, for example, Escazú, who trying to make this transparency, a participation mechanism more clear, and at least Erlo Center has been very active to make the relationship of right of nature and transparency and the protection of environmental defenders and the right to participate very clear, for example, since the beginning in the process of Escazú. So I agree, for example, for us, and I think in Latin America, also in the experience of Ecuador in general, right of nature are very related with the right of have the consultation of indigenous people, are very related in general. They are advocating together in many of these actions. So for sure, as Craig said, these constitutional rights are very, very, very close to each other, and I imagine in others model like in New Zealand and others where the participation of indigenous people or for the community through the guardianship models. Also, the presence of the community is at least a positive reinforcement to, I don't know if to avoid completely, but not incentivize this kind of corruption. But of course, we cannot say it's not going to happen, but at least is a way to not incentivize.
Shannon, this is
Speaking
Shiva
of,
here.
yeah, actually, I was going to come to you next. Please go ahead, Siva. And actually, I want to just try to put another question into that about incentivization. There's a question in the chat about, for you actually, incentivizing people themselves, individuals, for responsible consumption versus spending more effort on compliance and implementation with authorities. So yeah, please go ahead with what you were just saying, and also this this other question
I was just
as
going
well.
to say, in terms of corruption, at least from India point of view, it is awfully difficult. Corruption is so deep rooted, right? So that's what I meant initially when I said act and rules are found, but enforcement is quite weak. The enforcement, corruption comes under the enforcement as well, right? So you don't have enough, you're not deploying enough resources to enforce the rules. And then the problem is that the enforcers themselves are corrupt. So it's like it's a really a bad situation. I mean, you have cops on the road who catch you for a traffic violation, but you can bribe them and get away, right? And instead of, it doesn't become a learning lesson that you should not do this. It's rather the people repeat again because they can get away. The enforcement weak. So to me, in a country like India, corruption is so deep rooted. Unless there is a complete set change, it's going to be difficult. That's my own personal view. Let me put it that way. In terms of incentivizing, yeah, so I mean, for example, if there are products out there which are sustainable, which are, but those kind of incentives can be given for people who use them. I mean, I don't know how at a common man's level you would tend to give incentives, but I mean, for example, somebody brings back a plastic bottle and recycles it, etc. Maybe give them incentives in terms of points, etc. But I don't know how to do that. Honestly, at a common man's level, for a government point of view, giving incentive might be difficult to do. Companies can do that maybe if people buy or bring back the plastic in this case, or they use products which are sustainably made using sustainable sources. They can give some incentive to people who buy those. I mean, that can be maybe done at that level. From a government point of view, it might be very difficult at that level. Government can give incentives to industry to make these products so that consumers can buy at a reasonable price, etc. And then that would help. That's where the incentives can be given, and they should be given, and they are being given. So for electric vehicles is a good example where a lot of incentives are given by the government to make it to build scale, and you can see it's happening now. A lot of people are buying electric vehicles, and hopefully it'll be the future going forward.
Thanks, Siva. And yeah, it is an ongoing problem, and I see that it relates to this idea of Vijayata brought up this question about how do we achieve a just transition? I think this is what this whole conversation today is about. I think we're couching it under the rights of nature, but I think we've talked more broadly about a lot of strategies that we need to move forward towards to reach these commitments and to actually, I hope, also exceed them in many ways through this change in our minds. And with that, Abe, I really want to go to you, because another question that was asked was about working together. And you also run a wonderful, beautiful collaborative. We consider it our brother organization to our sister network. So, what does it mean to work together? We've heard this from all of you actually about working. So how do we actually work together when we have such disparate viewpoints, such distrust of each other across even across the table from each other, and many times?
Thanks, Shannon. I think for me, in some sense, what you mentioned earlier, the word listening is a very, very beautiful way to get into working together. And I think in some sense, listening also presupposes an articulation or an voicing, right? And this can even get to sublime levels of listening to the voice of nature and so on and so forth. But I think in some sense, for me, enabling spaces and enabling conditions for dialogue and conversation is the start of working together. And I'm quite an optimist, so I don't think positions are so set that one cannot see a move away from maximalist positions, right? So in some sense, once the conversation starts, there are possibilities of change or movement or transformation. And in that sense, uh, I mean, I'm really reflecting on my own role as an environmental activist in India. I constantly meet environmental activists or climate activists who are like, we will not work with that person, or we will certainly not turn up for this panel if X or Y is there, right? And for me, that is not the way forward, right? In some sense, I think one has to engage, one has to be willing to forgive, one has to be patient, and one has to be very, very firm in calling out greenwashing or other kinds of deceit. And all of this can happen together. So I think the working together doesn't mean that one is married for eternity, right? One can work together to the extent of, let's agree to disagree, or let's attempt to talk, and if we can't, we'll attempt maybe after 5 years. And I think just allowing for modalities of these kinds of connections to happen, right? And I think network type formulations are a great way to allow for these issue-based, consensus-based, geography-based, project-based coming together, and as needed, departing from a focus. And I think that's really the need of the hour, to build this connective tissue that allows people to work together, which is what the nonprofit that I'm affiliated with, the Initiative for Climate Action, is also very committed to doing. Thank you for the call out.
Oh, thank you. And I could not have said it more beautifully myself. And this was the purpose of this discussion, to hopefully provide a space for all of you experts who had such beautiful points today, but also for our audience members. And I hope that we will continue this conversation. It doesn't stop here. Please email us at info@ecconetwork.in if you have any questions. We'll try to connect you with these experts to help you answer them. So we're going to be taking the conversation forward over the next few months. Thank you to our wonderful, wonderful panel members. Also Kamal, who gave a beautiful beginning. I'm sorry we couldn't hear from Maureen today. Hopefully we'll try to bring her in at a later time in another discussion. Thank you to our audience members. This was a fantastic discussion. Let's take this forward, and let's see that we can ensure the rights for everyone, all humans, all animals, all plants, all our ecosystems on this planet, so that we can survive together as we go forward. Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of the summit.